Good evening and welcome to Stories for the Cooped Up and Captive. Last Sunday there was an article in the Wisconsin State Journal titled The Marriage of Science and Faith. They interviewed Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was raised in a very strictly Jesuit upbringing, but as an adult did not necessarily identify himself with a denomination or a practice of religion, but at the root of it all, very much was a person of faith. As to how that interdigitated with his science, he explained very simply, when you have faith, there is hope. There is always forward. Somehow, that made me think of a story that I had written several years ago. It was set in St. Lawrence Catholic Church in Decatur, Illinois on Christmas morning. Mom and Dad and I were sitting in the very back pew. We always sat in the very back pew because once upon a time when I was a little kid, Dad and I used to go fishing before church. One day before 8 o'clock Mass, we got into a particularly nice mess of crappie, and we smelled like it. When it came time to offer one another the sign of peace, we were met with some wrinkled noses and some not-so-friendly glances. So we always sat in the periphery. Well, in the front row, in the front pew of St. Lawrence Church, there was a young family. In the middle was a kid, probably 6 or 7 years old, swinging his legs under the pew, probably fantasizing of what might be in that big box under the Christmas tree. Next was Dad, Brian. Clearly more comfortable in his Carhartts at work than he was in his khakis and his Christmas sweater. Probably still had a little grease wedged under his fingernails. But he had his arm around his wife, Elizabeth, who had a rugged beauty of someone who had been there and lived to tell the stories. On the aisle was little John. In a wheelchair, his hands and feet gnarled, his head cocked to the side. During the responsorial psalm, he would let out a bark, his excuse for an amen. After church, I asked Mom and Dad about the family up front. Dad explained that about 15 years ago, the front row of a Catholic church on Christmas morning was exactly the last place you were likely to find Elizabeth. Instead, any given Saturday night, you'd find her at a corner bar stool, in search of anything she could find by the way of attention and a high. A lifestyle that by the time she was 22 years old rendered her a $100 habit and a gravid womb. And don't look now, but here comes the big stink, all the way to the backyard. In any event, at 22 years of age, she had choices. In spite of the fact that she was raised by a very solid nuclear family, Elizabeth had chosen an entirely different direction. But she went back to her family, who accepted her with open arms and conditions. Those conditions were that she get sober and she get a job. Well, she met those conditions and she raised him. She went back to church as well. From the minute little John was born, it was clear that he was different. He never walked, he never spoke, he was never able to take a bite of food on his own. He was about 5 or 6 years old on Easter Sunday morning, and Elizabeth was pushing him into their van when she got a tap on her shoulder. She turned to look at this ham-handed young gentleman shaking like a dog shitting razor blades, who said, "I was wondering if you guys might like to go to breakfast." Elizabeth's first reaction was that of defense. She looked at John and then she looked back at Brian and she said, "Do you not see what it is that I have to deal with?" And actually he had. In the month of Sundays that it took him to generate the courage to ask Elizabeth to breakfast, he had watched. She never apologized, she never made excuses for little John, and she talked to him like he was a little man. He was why Brian was asking Elizabeth out to dinner, out to breakfast. Now, I call this story Little John of God. I borrowed the title from a song of the same sentiment written by David Hidalgo of Los Lobos. It goes, "He came to us from up above. He gives to us a very special love. He can't run, he can't play. He does things in a different way. Little John of God." I call this a story about faith. Now you can place that faith in God if you wish. You can place that faith in Brian, little John, but by my way of thinking, This is all about Elizabeth, who found strength and she found faith in herself. And if she can, we can. If all else fails, keep something moving forward.